The silence of loneliness, an old man's silent cry in the midst of abandonment. Light filtered softly through the faded windowpane of a small, time-worn house. The morning sun hesitantly entered the room, as if even it feared to disturb the stillness within. Dust floated through the golden beams, dancing in the silence. Time had slowed down in this house, so much so that even its breath came and went gently. Edward Bennett, 78 years old, sat every morning in the same worn-out armchair by the window. The light touched the silver strands of his hair and cast long shadows over the creases on his face. Lines not just of age, but of absence. In his calloused, trembling hands, he held a letter. Its edges yellowed with time, corners bent from being folded and unfolded too many times. This letter had not been written yesterday or last month. It had been years. A letter addressed to his children, but never sent. Once this house had echoed with laughter, children running down the halls, plates clinking at the dinner table, a woman's warm voice calling out names. Now, silence reigned. The only noise was the ticking of the old wall clock, each tick another reminder of how slowly time passes when there is no one to share it with. Anna, his beloved wife, had passed away years ago. Since then, Edward had lived alone. His 3 children, Michael, Daniel, and Sophie, had slowly drifted away, pulled by the tide of their own lives. They had grown up, moved on, and little by little, left him behind like a fading photograph in an untouched album. Edward sat by the phone every day around noon. His eyes would rest on it with quiet hope. Sometimes he stared at it so long, his vision blurred, not from age, but from tears that never fully formed. Maybe today they will call. Maybe one of them will remember. But the phone never rang. One morning, his neighbor, Mrs. Taylor, peered through the window. Edward sat motionless in his chair. In his hands, again, that same letter. He wasn't reading it. He wasn't even looking at it. He was simply holding it, like a lifeline he never dared to cast. Concerned, Mrs. Taylor walked over and knocked on the door. "Edward, why are you always sitting here alone? Where are your children? Why don't they come to see you?" Edward turned his face slightly toward her, his eyes drifting off into the distance outside the window. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They grew up, and I grew old." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just an ocean of quiet sadness, a resignation that didn't scream, but settled heavily in the chest. Mrs. Taylor reached out and touched his shoulder gently, but even she didn't know what words could heal the kind of loneliness Edward carried. Because some silences are too deep for comfort. That night, Edward stood up slowly from his chair and walked to his writing desk. He opened a drawer, pulled out a piece of paper and an old pen. His fingers trembled as he gripped it. These were the same hands that once held his children's hands as they learned to walk, brushed away their tears, packed their school bags, and built their future. Now, they would write him into their past. He sat and began to write. Night had fallen. The room lay still, wrapped in quiet shadows, save for the soft golden glow of a small table lamp. Its dim light stretched across the desk, trembling slightly with every flicker, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Edward sat at his writing table, his back slightly hunched, his breathing slow and heavy. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves gently, like distant whispers of memories long gone. The silence in the room was different tonight. It wasn't the ordinary stillness of loneliness. It carried a strange finality, like the stillness before a curtain falls. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. It was smooth, untouched, almost too clean to hold what he was about to write. His fingers, worn and trembling, gripped the pen. That pen had once signed report cards, birthday cards, Christmas letters. Tonight, it would write his last. He stared at the paper for a long time. His heart pounded gently, not with fear, but with a quiet ache. Then slowly, he began to write. My dear children, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer in this world. He paused, His hand trembled. He closed his eyes for a moment and let his memories guide him. Not the happy ones. Not the loud, joyful holidays or the sunny birthdays. What came were the silences, the empty chairs, the unopened letters, the phone that never rang. He continued, "I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe you'll read it out of obligation. But I want to say these words anyway, because I've carried them inside for too long." Line by line, he poured out his soul. Each sentence bled with emotions he never said aloud. He wasn't angry. He was tired. He wasn't blaming. He was remembering. "I waited for a phone call. Every day I waited. Not because I wanted to be needed, but because I still needed to hear your voices. Just to know you were okay. I know you're busy. I know life moves fast. But love doesn't slow down when time speeds up. Sometimes I told myself you would call tomorrow. Then tomorrow came and left, just like the others." His handwriting had begun to slant, the pen slipping occasionally in his fingers. A tear dropped onto the corner of the page, soaking into the ink. He didn't wipe it. It belonged there. He looked up at the ceiling. It was bare, just like the path between him and the children he once held close to his heart. "Michael, you were always the serious one. Even as a boy, you wanted to lead. I was proud of you, even if I never said it enough. Daniel, your music used to fill this house. Do you still play? Or has your guitar, like this home, grown quiet? Sophie, my little angel, you used to sit in my lap and whisper stories into my ear. I remember every one." He took a deep breath. This was the hardest part. "I don't ask for anything. No apologies, no explanations. I only ask that your own children never feel what I felt. That they never wait at a window, hoping for the sound of a key in the door. That they never sit by a phone, praying for a voice that never comes. And if you've forgotten me, then at least remember this. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." When he finished, he set the pen down slowly. His hand remained hovering over the paper for a few seconds more, as if reluctant to let go. He carefully folded the letter. The paper crinkled gently, like the last sigh of a long-held breath. He placed it in an envelope, sealed it, but didn't write any names on it. The words were enough. Whoever found it would know. He stood up, returned to the armchair by the window, and sat down one last time. The night had grown colder, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes settled on the photograph of Anna on the shelf. A faint smile crossed his lips. "Anna, I'm ready now." The room fell silent again. But this time, it was a peaceful silence, like the closing of a final chapter, written in love, wrapped in memory, and sealed with goodbye. A phone call that pierces years of silence. Morning had broken. The sky was heavy and gray. It wasn't raining, but it wasn't clear either. It felt like the world itself didn't know how to greet this day. Mrs. Taylor, Edward's kind and observant neighbor, noticed something was off. Edward's house, normally lit with the soft glow of a morning lamp, was dark. No flickering shadows behind the curtains, no rustle from inside. A sense of unease took over. She dressed quickly and hurried over. Knocked on the door, twice, then thrice. No answer. With trembling hands, she contacted the authorities. When the door was finally opened, the silence inside felt heavier than ever. It was not just the absence of sound. It was the echo of a life that had quietly ended. Edward was seated in his usual armchair, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. In his hands, gently held but firm, was the letter. The officers stood quietly. Mrs. Taylor's tears began to fall, not only for the man who had passed, but for the truth that came with it. He died alone, waiting. The calls to his children. Michael, the eldest son, was in a boardroom, mid-meeting. His assistant walked in, whispering urgently. Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry. It's your father. He passed away. Michael froze. His hands rested on the table, unmoving. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. The meeting room fell into silence. But this was not ordinary silence. It was the weight of a silence they had ignored for too long. Daniel, in the bustling heart of London, received the call in the middle of traffic. He answered casually. "What? My father?" He stopped speaking, for a few seconds just breathing. Then finally, I won't be able to come. I'm sorry." His voice was flat, but behind it, something cracked. Sophie, their youngest, answered the phone at home. Her first question wasn't, "What happened?" It was he alone? Yes. He was at home, holding the letter. She dropped the phone, fell to her knees. For a moment, no sound. Then her sobs filled the room, slow at first, then shaking like a flood finally released. Returning to the house. Days later, all three returned to the house of their childhood. Same old door, same walls, same air filled with memories. But one thing had changed. Their father was no longer waiting inside. On the table, in the center of the living room, lay a single envelope. It bore no name, but they all knew this was meant for them. Sophie reached for it first. Her fingers brushed the paper like it might crumble. Michael took a long breath. Daniel said nothing. Because sometimes, words can't fill the space between what was said and what should have been. A father, a letter, and the voice of a love that had long been silent. The room had fallen into a heavy, almost sacred silence. All eyes were fixed on the envelope resting on the table. A faded, slightly wrinkled envelope. No name written on it. Yet everyone in the room knew exactly who it was meant for. Sophie stepped forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if touching the envelope would awaken something fragile and long forgotten. She reached out, picked it up. It trembled slightly between her fingers, though it wasn't the paper. It was her heart. She sat down. Her breath trembled as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, the handwriting immediately familiar. Her father's. She unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, and began to read aloud. Her voice was soft at first, then grew steadier with each line, each breath. "My dear children, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. But these words have remained in my heart, waiting to be spoken." Silence swept through the room like a wave. This was no ordinary letter. This was a voice from beyond time, from a man who had waited too long to be heard. It was not a message of blame. It was a confession of love, of pain, and of quiet endurance. Michael lowered his gaze. In his mind, he heard his father's voice, teaching him to ride a bike, cheering him on, whispering, "You can do it, son." And then, the silence that followed. Not because his father had stopped speaking, but because he had stopped listening. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. Memories surfaced. His father sitting beside him, guiding his fingers along a guitar string, encouraging him with every note. Now, he could almost hear the quiet music again, muffled under layers of time and distance. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she continued. "I never scolded you, I only missed you. Each night I sat by the window and wondered, where are they now? Are they happy? Every day I hoped for a call, just to hear a voice. It never came." Each word from the page became heavier. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken apologies, full of forgotten hugs, full of lost time. Michael looked up at a photo on the wall, a younger version of himself in a school uniform, standing next to his father. In the photo, they were both smiling. Now, that smile was something else entirely, a mirror of what could have been. Daniel stood and walked to the corner of the room. There, untouched for years, sat his old guitar. He brushed the dust from it, not to play it, just to touch it, just to feel his father's memory in the wood. Sophie read the final lines. I ask nothing from you. I only hope that one day, when you have children of your own, they never feel what I felt. May they never wait by a window, wondering why you never came. May they never sit by a phone, praying for a voice that won't arrive. And if you've forgotten me, please remember this. I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day. When she finished, her voice broke. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence in the room now felt different. Not empty, but changed. They had all entered this house again believing they knew who their father was. Now, through his final words, they realized they had only known part of him. What they had forgotten, he had remembered. What they had left behind, he had carried. This letter wasn't just a message. It was a bridge, reaching back in time, across absence, across silence, and offering one final embrace. The sky was draped in gray, neither raining nor clear. A quiet morning hung in the air. The sun remained hidden, as if even it did not wish to interrupt the stillness of the moment. Michael, Daniel, and Sophie stood silently in front of a fresh grave. The soil was soft, the flowers newly placed, and their father's name, Edward Bennett, engraved gently on the stone. A father who waited in silence. Time moved slowly. None of them spoke. They stood as three children, no longer shielded by the noise of life, finally exposed to the weight of what they had lost. Michael knelt by the grave. He touched the earth with trembling fingers and whispered, "You waited for us. Every day. And we didn't come. I thought I had more time. I thought you'd always be there." His eyes filled with tears he no longer tried to hide. Daniel opened his guitar case beside the grave. He held the same guitar his father had once given him. Quietly, he strummed the first notes of his father's favorite melody. The strings quivered in the wind, each note like a sigh rising from the ground. It was more than a song. It was an apology in music, a confession without words. Sophie, tears streaming freely, laid a scarf beside the grave, one her father always wore in winter. She pressed it into the grass and whispered, "I should have called, should have visited. I was always too busy. But you never stopped loving me. Not once." They remained there, in stillness, not just mourning a death, but mourning the time they let slip through their fingers. A quiet return to home. Back at their father's house, the air felt different, no longer empty, but echoing. Michael approached the old wall clock, the one his father used to wind every morning. It had been still for years. He opened the back, adjusted the hands, and slowly turned the key. Tick, tick, tick. The sound returned, subtle yet alive. The house breathed again. Daniel dusted the top of the piano. He didn't play it, not yet. But he sat before it in silence, feeling the weight of memories in every key. Sophie took the letter, the one her father had left them, and placed it in a frame. She hung it above the fireplace. Beneath it she wrote, "Love your parents while they're alive, because once they're gone, it's too late." That evening, the three of them sat together. No one said much. They didn't have to. The house spoke for them, in ticking clocks, in faint scents, in the hush of a home no longer waiting. Final image. The camera slowly pans across the room. The framed letter, the guitar, the softly ticking clock, family photos in faded frames, and finally the armchair, Edward's chair, empty now, but filled with light. Because some people leave this world, but their love remains, not in their voices, but in the silence they leave behind.